This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find it on our homepage. I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Shandlin.
And I am your co-host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Eviatar Zerubavel. He is a professor of sociology at Rutgers University in New Jersey and an expert in cognitive sociology. In his new book called Taken for Granted, The Remarkable Power of the Unremarkable, published in 2018 by Princeton University Press, he discusses how words and phrases we use in our language reinforce cultural norms. Eviatar Zerubavel, hello, and welcome to the show.
Very nice to be here.
Thank you very much. So maybe it may sound like a daft question, but I think it's a good place to start. Why is the taken for granted an important object of inquiry in your view? Because it's almost a tautological question, because if certain things were important, we wouldn't be taking them for granted, right?
Absolutely. That's the switch. The switch is, from my standpoint, epistemically speaking, it's reversing the look, reversing the gaze, and instead of looking at the figure, looking at the background. And I actually published 3 years earlier a book called Hidden in Plain Sight, which is focused on the background. And I wrote before that Elephant in the Room, a book about silence. So I've been attracted to that stuff which is obvious. And why is it important? Precisely because it's obvious and because of that unlooked at. So it's actually the process that I also discuss in the book of foregrounding, which is taking something from the background and bringing it to the foreground.
So this puts you, to my mind, in company with some very good people, like George Orwell, who wrote Right in Front of Your Nose, or Antonio Gramsci, right, the notion of hegemony in culture and language, Foucault, who critiqued the power that's present everywhere. What were you trying to add to those existing perspectives?
Actually, the one who influenced me most in that respect was my mentor, Irving Goffman. And Goffman single-handedly founded what came to be known as the sociology of everyday life. And if you think about what is everyday life, this is the stuff that, for example, Georges Perec tried to do in his fiction. It's what is everyday life? It's all the stuff that falls between the chairs. It's the stuff that doesn't have name. And what I add here is a sociological perspective to semiotics. The distinction between markedness and unmarkedness is a semiotic distinction that goes back to 1930 linguistics. But I'm looking at the social cultural basis of making that distinction, reinforcing that and reproducing that asymmetry, and also the sociology of the subversion of that.
Well, I think that's sort of the main reason why I asked about those other figures, because all of those other people came from history and politics
and philosophy
and nationalism. There's a study on nationalism called The Banality of Nationalism by Michael Billig. Why did you decide to start from the perspective of language?
It's actually, when I applied to graduate school, which is 46, 47 years ago, I wrote that my interest would be in the sociology of language. And what I meant by sociology of language is much more the semiotic stuff. I didn't have the language for that then. The first few years of my career, I actually worked mostly on time, on calendars, schedules, rhythms. And I came back to what I call cognitive sociology only later, and somehow didn't write specifically about language. What is interesting in language here is that it actually highlights the distinction between what is nameable and what is unnameable. And what's fantastically interesting that I found is that the more dominant your identity is, the less nameable you'll be. So it's actually...
What do you mean by that? Can you give us an example?
Sure. For example, whiteness. So in American culture, for example, in American sociology, the study of race until the 80s was almost absolutely exclusively on non-whites, in the same way that the study of gender that started in the 60s, 70s was a study of femalehood. So the idea of studying masculinity or the idea of studying whiteness. And later you have the same thing in the studies of sexuality, that when you talk about sexual orientation, you're talking about homosexuality, about bisexuality, and what happens to heterosexuality. The same thing in terms of ability, ableness. The study of disability has been there for quite some time, but lately you start looking at able-bodiedness and questioning, problematizing that. So to go back to your original question, it's, Dalia, it's actually the challenge of problematizing something that is not treated as problematic. Now, there's one figure in sociology who has done the pioneering work in that in the 60s, Harold Garfinkel, who started what's called ethnomethodology. And he argued that phenomenologists have been looking at how you take problematic things and make them routine. The whole idea of routinization is part of institutionalization. What he tried to do is to reverse it and say, let's see how we problematize the routine instead of routinizing the problematic. And in a way, and he did it by obtrusively asking people to behave in a way that is obtrusive, that is disruptive. And I'm interested in doing the disruption cognitively, as we read, as we speak. And so a lot of this happens around language. And I'm looking at the asymmetry between semiotic pairs, one of which is marked and one of which is unmarked, and one of which is, because of that, one of which is named and the other is unnamed. And it's fascinating because on the surface, you would think that functionally, structurally, they're equivalent, yet there's a great asymmetry between them because one of them has the presence of a sign and the other has the absence of the sign.
Okay, now we have to unpack it a bit for our listeners who aren't initiated sociologists such as Dalia here.
Well, or who don't have the example in mind of the cheeseburger and the ketchup burger, which I hope we're going to talk about.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, actually, that's a good example. Go on.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll actually ask the three questions.
Wait, just so you know that I'm an intellectual. I know about the ketchup burger. Yeah. Now I do. Tell us.
I took actually two questions that I opened previous book, Social Mindscapes and Ancestors and Relatives, and added a third one. So the three questions that I opened the book with: why, when I take a hamburger and I add a piece of cheese, slice of cheese, it becomes a cheeseburger. When I add ketchup, it doesn't become ketchup burger. Question number 2, why is Barack Obama considered in America a black man with a white mother instead of a white man with a black father? Third question, why is there a word such as, an idiom such as openly gay, and you don't have the equivalent of openly straight? So in all three cases, I'm actually doing this challenging, this problematizing that I mentioned, which is that I take something that is obvious, and because it's obvious, it's self-evident, you don't think about it, and I'm saying, let's think about it, and let's try to spell out what's happening here. How is it that part of reality becomes perceived as normal and the other as pathological?
The obvious and the normal here, you said it earlier, it's tied to the culturally dominant, right? What we think as obvious, of course, is what we see, the more powerful images around us. But the question is whether it's not just statistical. I mean, the fact that in America, which was at least originally a white country, Barack Obama would be black because, most people are white.
Originally, it was a red country.
Okay, fair enough. And also the majority of couples and the majority of people are heterosexual. Therefore, why don't you just see this as like a normal extension of the statistical reality around us?
Because I learned from Simone de Beauvoir that women are not a statistical minority and are still treated as marked.
Can I challenge you on that? Because your analysis of that and anybody's claim, which is true, that women are more than 50% of the majority. In many Western countries, they're 51%, but treated like a minority. Of course, there is discriminatory treatment and different ways of thinking about women. But in some of the cases, I understand it. For example, you give the great joke about the surgeon, Would you like to tell the joke about the surgeon?
It's not a joke.
Well, it's not a joke.
It's a riddle.
It's a trick.
It's a riddle.
But it's going to help me make the point that I want to probe you on.
Okay, so the riddle is about a father who took his son to a ball game. The father is driving, they're crossing the railway tracks, and the signal didn't work, so a train comes, the car is gone, the father dies on the spot, the boy is in a very serious condition, and some passerby takes him to an hospital. They rush him to the operation room. And the surgeon enters, looks at the child, and says to the others, "You must be kidding. You don't expect me to operate on my own son. How come?" And in the last few years, I've asked this riddle many, many people, and I get very interesting answers such as, well, one was the biological father, one was the legal father, one was the stepfather, one was...
Our listeners are in total suspense right now.
This is a gay couple, so you have two fathers, and so on and so forth. And then I offer another possibility, which has not been mentioned yet, which is that the surgeon is the boy's mother. And usually what people do is immediately catch their face. They're ashamed, as I was when I first heard it and didn't catch it. And what you get here is the sense that it's taken for granted that when you talk, and I call this andronormativity, that when you talk about a person and you don't mention that it's a woman, you assume that it's a man.
Okay, but here's where I want to challenge you, because I happen to look up the numbers, and it turns out that only 19% of surgeons are women in America today.
That's
and
true.
that means 81% are men. So is this really a misguided, or is it really an arbitrary social construct for the purposes of maintaining the patriarchy? Or is language reflecting a social reality? And, it does that in a natural and organic way, because this is society and language evolves to describe the shared experience we all have.
Well, then comes Benjamin Worf and the point that language is not only express our thinking, but also shapes our thinking. And I'm taking it very seriously. So it's true that in this riddle, the fact that we're talking about a surgeon also brings something hierarchical. It's a prestigious thing, and you don't expect. And as you say, the history is that now you say that there are 19%.
This is the present. In other words, 81% of the time, if you go to a surgeon, it's going to be a man, and your brain is programmed to understand abstract experiences.
Let me give you a counterexample from a different context. So it used to be the case, and feminists have argued this since the 80s, that most of the studies, medical studies, are done on men, and then they're extrapolated to also apply to women. There were studies that were done on women, and they were never extrapolated to men. Okay? So what's happening there? The asymmetry is that a woman is a woman, and a man is both a man and a human being. And that's the asymmetry. When you talk about people who are not gendered, characterized, specified, you're not going to talk about them and assume immediately that they're women unless you're very, very sensitive to that issue.
I want to take you back to Worf's premise on how language shapes reality, and ask you about, it's perhaps the chicken and egg question here that troubles you a lot in the book. Which came first, right? Is it the language that shaped reality, or reality that shaped language, or both ways? And how do you even make the distinction?
Well, I think it's dialectical. This is our answer to deal with these issues. But I should add about the chicken and the egg, as I relate to this, and this is a guy, a 19th century thinker called Samuel Butler, who suggested that actually the chicken is a way for one egg to make another egg. And when I first heard it, I thought, how brilliant.
Yeah.
This is exactly this foregrounding, this switching, what you focus on and what you don't focus on. Between the chicken and the egg, we assume that the chicken has the agency. So, of course, the egg is just a way for one chicken to make another chicken. But when he says the chicken is a way for one egg to make another egg, suddenly it gives agency to the egg. And he's not wrong, that's the point. And there was, Kermode wrote in the 60s about, we said, when I listen to the tick-tock of the clock, I don't know if I'm listening to the tick-tock or the talk-tick. Which one is it?
But as far as I understand, I don't want to, project my interpretation onto your book, but tell me if I'm correct to read into what you're saying, that the group that we tend to not notice, the one that we forget, the one that's taken for granted, is the power hegemony, right? That's the group that holds the power.
As a group.
As a group, of course, not as individuals. And I guess I'm trying to think of how to phrase this question. I guess reading your book, I get the impression that you are implying there is a social construct, not just implying. You say these are socially constructed norms. But we're agreeing in a way that there is some influence of the actual nature of things. You know, the fact that in America the majority once was white after it was red. And that the same thing would apply in a black country in Africa, that if a white person showed up, they would probably remark on it because most of them are black and they probably wouldn't point out another black person, but they might point out another white person. So isn't it not so much a social construct of maintaining our peculiar Western hierarchy? It hasn't been totally constructed, but maybe it's a rather shared value.
In other
to
words,
look at the statistical majority and make them or give them an unnamed reference, and the statistical minority or the less common experience anywhere in the world will probably be marked and named as rather a shared value, not specifically constructed social hierarchy that may be peculiar to one country or the other.
The way that I use to solve these kind of problems is that I start thinking comparatively, and I'm starting to think about other contexts, either cross-culturally or cross-historically or cross-situationally. And here is something that jumps to my mind. I was 2 years ago in India and traveled a lot and ate in a lot of Indian restaurants and was stunned by the fact that on almost all the menus that I looked at, there was one little group at the end that said non-vegetarians, which is, of course, reversing the way that we usually think about. Then I learned that the Indians have a concept for what we call marriage and they call love marriage, because what we call the arranged marriage, they call marriage. So this I find very, very useful. Then I look historically, and this is where the retronyms come that we talked about before, earlier. You know, acoustic guitar. Acoustic guitar is a fantastic example of a concept that could have only existed since the 1930s invention of the electric guitar. The amazing thing, of course, is that there were acoustic guitars since the Renaissance or a little after that. You didn't call them acoustic guitars in the same way that you don't talk about live music. You talked
until
about
you had recorded music.
And only when
this is exactly, I think you've put your finger on what I was trying, maybe not so well, to articulate about my question, which is, do we really think there's a socially constructed power hegemony between acoustic guitars and electric guitars? I'm guessing not so much. It doesn't really influence our lives.
I don't. Yeah.
So where do we draw the line between that kind of not very meaningful, but simple linguistic distinction and a social system of control and power?
So a social system, my best example probably is the concept of alternative medicine. I find it a very insulting term to anyone who is an alternative medicine practitioner, because it means that it's only alternative. There's medicine, and there are all those alternative ones. But it's very tricky. Years ago, and I didn't grow up in the United States, so I don't take the English language for granted. I'm listening to the stuff that as a native English speaker I wouldn't have listened to. So, because it's much harder for me to do all this in Hebrew, which is my native language.
No, but now you've revealed the answer to my first question, which was, why did you start with language? Now we get it. Because when you live in your second language, as I know as an immigrant, which Gilad, despite appearances, actually is a native Israeli, we think about the meaning of every word because we're busy trying to figure it out our whole lives.
Absolutely. So I want to give you this example. And several years ago, I wouldn't have felt comfortable to share it with you, but now I feel very, very confident about it. I first heard about, 10, 15 years ago, the American concept, white trash. And I heard it and I thought, did I hear right? White trash? How can one say something so racist so bluntly? And people said, what racist? What are you talking about? And I said, this is a racist remark. And said, what's racist about it? So I said, well, tell me, how do you understand the concept of white trash? And many people told me, well, it's basically a white person who is very poor, lives in a trailer, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, you're telling me why the word trash, but I'm asking you not about the noun, but about the adjective. Why white trash. Because if it was not white, would you say black trash? And my assumption is that the racist underlying assumption here is that blacks are trash. So you don't have to say it. It will be redundant. It's like saying female nurse. You have to say male nurse because it's the non-redundant, not superfluous one.
And then that actually leads me to a question that I've wanted to ask for quite a while now about, this movement between languages, and particularly in your case and mine as well, between a gendered language and a non-gendered language. And in English, there's really no distinction between male and female nouns. Does it complicate or uncomplicate your endeavor?
Well, I can tell you that I tried a number of times to ask the riddle in Hebrew, and there's no way that you can do it. There's no way that you can do it. What I find fascinating is that as a native Hebrew speaker, by the age of 3, I knew what's the gender of a window, of a speaker, of a tooth, and so on. And what's amazing, of course, is the idea that these things shouldn't have gender. Why do we gender them?
I can put you at ease because most Israelis get them wrong now too.
Yeah.
Especially in the plural.
Especially in the plural, in saying shalosh, shlosha, and so on. But this historian of science, Londa Shibinger, who made the point about how nature has been gendered, how Linnaeus in the 18th century introduced into botany the concept of gender. And this isn't about sex, this is about gender, and why do you have to gender plants? Mm-hmm. So why do you have to gender windows and ashtrays and teeth? I find it amazing. I'll also find another thing amazing in the moving from between the Hebrew and the English language. I'm writing now a book about analogical theorizing, and I'm interested in, it's actually a methodological, theoretical book on how I've done a lot of my work in the last 25 years. And a lot of it is based on analogies. I do cross-contextual, trans-contextual comparisons of situations. So it's cross-cultural, cross-historical, cross-situational, and so on. And I'm trying to see similarities among things that are different. So, for example, I argue it would be very useful for people who study transgender persons to read about immigration, and for people who study immigration to learn about people who are transgendered. Now, the contexts are totally different. Why would you talk about citizenship and gender in the same context? And the point is that it's precisely because we're used to think about them in different contexts. So, several months ago, I gave a talk at Yale, and one of the students said, "Do you realize that this may have to do with the fact that you're a native Hebrew speaker?" And immediately I never thought about it, that Semitic languages, because we have these 3 consonant root, we can see things that are very quote-unquote different as similar. So here is a Worfian thing, that the part of what makes me sensitive to analogies is the very fact that I'm a native speaker of a Semitic language.
I love this example but I honestly think that given that I'm an immigrant immersed in Hebrew life every day, that I often come up with these connections because I'm constantly thinking, where does that Hebrew word come from? Whereas my Israeli colleagues are not thinking. They just take it for granted, so to speak.
So I have to tell you again, and I don't remember if I mentioned to you, maybe it's when we talked before, my mentor was Irving Goffman, and what I learned from him is to look at familiar things as if they are strange. And he would show, for example, in class, a slide of a man standing pretty erect like this and a woman leaning with her head on his shoulder. And he would say, try to reverse it. Try to think of a woman standing like this and a man putting it. And immediately you find it funny. So surprises and disappointments tell me about expectations. Expectations are very hard to study. If I study what happens when they are not met, I'll be able to see them. So to me, surprises, flops, things that don't work, that you're kind of what's going on, tell me a lot about your default assumptions. And this book is a study of default assumptions.
Which is why I think it's beautiful that you have a chapter on poetry and how poetry highlights the mundane and elevates it to a different level. And that brings me to another question, which is trying to move on from the way things are now to the way things may be changing in the future. I have to confess that when I read the chapter Marked and Unmarked, I couldn't help this association with the concept of the sacred and the profane.
Of course.
Oh, so I'm glad that I'm not the only one thinking about this.
No.
But in a way, it's a reversal, right? Because there, the deviant.
You've got to explain what it is.
Yeah, I mean, this is the theory of religion.
Okay,
You can explain it.
As a sociologist, for me, the critical text here is Emil Durkheim's Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. And he talks about the fact that what you have in every religion, I'm not sure he's right there about that factually, but every religion distinguishes the sacred from the profane. Now, you ask what's the sacred, and it's what society decides it's sacred. There's nothing inherently sacred in anything. And what's the profane? That which is not sacred. So they come like this, each one of them defines the other. Well, to me, Durkheim's distinction is actually a semiotic distinction between that which is special and that which is ordinary, which in 1930 Trubetskoy and Jacobson called marked and unmarked. But that's what it is about. That's what it is about. So there is a couple of British anthropologists, Miller and Woodward, I think, who wrote a book about blue jeans. And the subtitle is the study of the ordinary. And they realized that the most important thing that they had to say about blue jeans is that they got to understand the notion of ordinariness.
So how do you come up with an object of inquiry here? You really have to put your mind to finding what it is, right? Have you been collecting examples of cheeseburger and ketchup burgers and others?
Couples and same-sex couples.
Openly straight.
Openly straight. Tell us a bit about how...
Okay. So this is actually this book that I'm doing now. I'm also talking about how do you start... It's using analogies and looking for... first of all, it's getting away from looking at case studies, at single case studies. The idea is to take examples from a lot of very different contexts. One of the things that I do is that I collect these things over many years, not just when I start working on a particular project, because I've been sensitized to this from early on. And it pays off because you start seeing things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And I've noticed in many studies that I'm getting to see, for example, when I worked on this book on conspiracies of silence, The Elephant in the Room, this was one of the two first attempts to look at denial sociologically. Well, how can you look at denial sociologically? Because the denial is that which you don't allow to enter your consciousness. Well, here is the thing in conspiracies of silence, that it is in your consciousness, but you try to make sure that it doesn't slide from that outside, so you pretend that you didn't see what you saw, that you didn't hear what you actually heard, and so on. So it's actually going in reverse, and I've just developed a sensitivity to this, and I'll give you an example of, it's not great observational skills, it's just being very focally committed to a particular theme. So to me, in the social sciences, one of the most critical distinctions, they say, is between quantitative and qualitative research. I don't see the difference at all, and I think that the big difference is between thematically driven and data-driven research. So when I'm writing a book like this, I don't do data-driven research. I do thematically driven. And the data start flowing into your eyes and your ears, because when you are focused on something, it starts coming. And I just read this beautiful saying of Louis Pasteur, who was asked about the role of chance in science, serendipity. And he says, chance visits only the prepared mind. So I'm actually preparing the mind in advance to start focusing on a certain thematic stuff.
And I'd like to ask you another question that kind of cropped up during our discussion here, and that is about the radical scope of your research, of how to really make...
Epistemically radical.
That's exactly my question. Because other more radical theorists, I'm thinking about Terry Eagleton and perhaps Bourdieu,
politically
driven, have also been talking about what we take for granted in terms of ideology, right? The things that we, from a very early age, we think that we know and aren't necessarily true.
What Dalia mentioned about Gramsci is a classic example.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Bourdieu said this beautiful line that those things go without saying because they came without saying, right? We're just imbued from a very early stage. But their goal was to unpack and unravel these structures. That doesn't seem to strike me as your goal.
Not at all. Not at all. Actually, as a sociologist, I have to admit that when I came to sociology in the late 60s, early 70s, I was never driven by Marx. And in the 70s and the 80s and 90s, I was never driven by Foucault. So I'm learning a lot from these guys, but I'm not motivated ideologically. I'm motivated by, as I mentioned before, when you said radical, I said epistemically radical, because that's very different than being ideologically radical. So my attempt is not to change the world, but to make people think about things that maybe otherwise they wouldn't have thought. And it's a cognitive thing now that can have a lot of political implications, but that's not my game.
But this brings me to the sort of the next part of the question I wanted to ask about this dichotomy between sacred and profane, because my feeling is that regardless of your work before or after, things are changing.
Yeah.
And certainly in the discourse in America today of who's the norm and who's the deviant, it's changing, and identity politics and Me Too, and we are calling what used to be considered deviant is becoming a source of pride, a source of political empowerment.
Look at America's president.
I mean, I was thinking in terms of the sacred and the profane.
Candidate that lost to the American
that too,
president.
that
I think
too.
that's a very good
example. And you
example.
refer to that in your book.
Yeah.
But the idea is that if the sacred was deviant in the past because it was a break from the profane norm, and it was sacred, in the world you're talking about, the deviants have been the oppressed. And now they are embracing and empowering themselves. And in a way, they're becoming sacralized, maybe, because that gives you credibility to talk about all sorts of social opinions that, what do they say now, like a cisgender white male doesn't have the credibility to say.
Right.
And I mean, the profanity is no longer invisible.
Right. So I'm glad you brought the cisgender, because this was exactly on the tip of my tongue. I wanted to bring, and when we talked before about the politics, I wanted to say that, it's not my game to do the politics, but it can have political implications. And one of the examples is with the cisgender. When I first heard the term, I couldn't understand what it meant. And when I heard what it is, I said, why do you need a term? And then immediately I caught myself and said, and that's the point. So the point is, and you have the same thing with neurotypicals and with vanilla sex. These three terms I think are so interesting in that they're doing foregrounding of something that, so cisgender. So I'm cisgender because I identify with the sex that I was assigned when I was born. It didn't have a name. And the point is that the transgender has a name. So you think, wow, this transgender is special. But we've already talked about the fact that the special is also the deviant. The deviant is the special. So by creating that term, whoever came up with that term did a politically brilliant thing of trying to put the cisgender and the transgender semiotically on the same footing. And you say, well, you have a name, I'm deviant, so are you. I'm abnormal, so are you. In a way, it takes away the concept of normality. So in vanilla sex, the kinky sex, advocate would say, you come and tell us that, we are deviant and so on. Well, let's make you lexically also deviant by calling you vanilla sex.
Although in this case, it's a great example where the statistics are in favor of the deviants, which you point out from Kinsey's material.
Yeah.
Aha, we've caught you, human race.
Exactly. All right, Professor Eviatar Zerubavel, sociologist at Rutgers University, and the author of several books, most recently Taken for Granted, The Remarkable Power of the Unremarkable. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And also big thanks to Julia Brahms, our producer, to Gizem Ozdemir, and to Itai Shalom, our producer. And now we have a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we have a special request here. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then, of course, write one. Check out our archive. It has more than 450 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. the Tel Aviv Review podcast, Ideas from Israel. That's our page name. And you can follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.